Thank you, Mr President. I too would like to contribute to this condolence debate on the passing of the Right Honourable Malcolm John Fraser. It's the first condolence debate I've contributed to, and I made a decision to do that because I've always been fascinated by the very challenging views that Malcolm Fraser held through his life, and sometimes I feel it's a bit of a Rorschach ink test for people. When you ask people what they think about Malcolm Fraser, you can probably pretty clearly determine what side of politics they're on and what they think about a range of other issues, because he had views across such a wide range of policy areas that challenged people and were quite controversial and inspired people to want to respond to that. And I think we should celebrate that. Perhaps in this corner of the chamber, though, we're a little bit different. I think Malcolm Fraser was probably associated or endorsed candidates from almost all political parties, except probably for the Nationals and country parties. And he was probably a bit like Billy Hughes in that regard. He was a member of 6 political parties, but not the country party. And as Billy Hughes said when someone pointed this out, a man has to draw standards somewhere, draw a line somewhere. But I think Malcolm Fraser is actually a great demonstration of the diversity of what being a Conservative means at times. There's no guidebook or ideology or Bible or gospel for conservatism. It's a principle and a cause that responds to the events of the time and seeks to protect and cherish different aspects of our society, depending on the time. And we should always remember that Malcolm and his generation either grew up fighting the Second World War, or in Malcolm Fraser's case, living in the shadows of the Second World War. And many of his views, I think, on individual freedom, on the protection of our country and society, and the need to defend those freedoms flow from that experience. While many on our side of politics are challenged by many of his views, I think we should always celebrate that I think he brought a considered and contemplative approach to public policy issues, and he was still contributing to those issues right up to his passing last week. His passing was too soon in my regard, because clearly he was still a very vibrant contributor to our public debate, and it is a sad loss to that wider debate that we are part of that is no longer here. I just want to spend a brief time, though, going back to the formative years of Malcolm's life and to put his wider views in context of that experience of the Second World War and the environment of Australia at the time. Right back at the beginning of Malcolm's political career, he was only 25 years old when he headed down to Hamilton on the southern coast of Australia to participate in a pre-selection for the Liberal and Country Party of Victoria, it was then called. And it was a happy coincidence that it was 22 years to the day from when he was made Prime Minister in 1975 that this pre-selection took place on the 11th of November 1953. And at that pre-selection, Malcolm gave a speech from his heart, and I just want to quote a little bit from that. He said, "Each man from the street cleaner to the industrialist behind a rich desk has an equal right to a full and happy life. Each one has an equal right to go his own way, unhampered so long as he does not harm our precious social framework. The wish that men may continue to enjoy this right is the real reason that urges me to enter a lifelong fight against socialism, and I feel that this fight is worthwhile because of the unique and individual characteristics I find in every person." That's something that speaks to my heart as well. I just want to note a couple of amusing anecdotes as well. On that night, Malcolm faced a fierce opponent, a former senator of this place. Senator Magnus Cormack was his main opponent. And after giving his speech, which was clearly quite captivating, a supporter of Senator Cormack's decided to ask Malcolm a very tough question about US antitrust law. Thought he'd flummox the young Malcolm, but unfortunately for him, Malcolm had just finished a stint at Oxford and he just finished writing an assignment on that very topic, so he expounded for 5 minutes, very knowledgeable on it, and he succeeded. Later on, he started campaigning, as we all do, for our seats, and I just love this story. He went, during that campaign, he went to a small town, I think called Durham, I think I got that pronunciation right, and when he arrived in this town during the campaign, it was meant to be a political meeting. Only one person had turned up, and I think we could probably all appreciate how that feels. And Malcolm proposed to this one person, to his audience of one, that instead of having a meeting like was planned, why don't the two of them just go to the pub and have a beer? And his audience of one, however, had different ideas. He said to Malcolm, "I came here to hear your policy," he insisted, "and if your only policy is to buy a beer, I'm not going to vote for you." So Fraser told him that was absurd. How could I make a speech to an audience of one? But the man insisted. He said, "You get up there on that platform and give me a policy." So Malcolm did. He got up on the platform, started speaking, gave a speech of almost 10 minutes to this audience of one, and then in the middle of a sentence, his audience got to his feet and started for the door, calling over his shoulder that if that's all the policy you've got, we may as well just go have a beer. And I love that story. I think it's a very Australian one, and it's probably something familiar to most of us. And I will cut some of my remarks short, as I know there are other speakers still, but I do want to just go back to the points I made about Malcolm's focus on defending Australia. We, I think, and particularly my generation, take for granted the security and peace that we benefit from, but we are still a rather sparsely populated continent on the edge of a very volatile world. And that was obviously very clear and present for Malcolm's generation, and it was still present in the 1960s when he came to the Australian Parliament. And others have noted in this debate that he was a strong and ardent and vigorous supporter of the Vietnam War at the time. And I want to note that he was not just influenced by the Second World War in this regard. He studied a historian called Alfred Toynbee at Oxford, and Toynbee's principles of sacrifice and discipline and survival just come through all of Malcolm's speeches, particularly his early ones. He said it on a debate after he went to Vietnam and the US in 1964, and then when he coming back, Malcolm said to Parliament that in the past civilisations have been destroyed and peoples have been disappeared from the earth because they could not withstand the dangers that beset them. I cannot assume that Australia's survival is inevitable, any more than was the survival of past civilisations that did not and would not accept the challenge that confronted them. Our survival requires courage, a sense of duty and direction, and some greater sacrifice from every one of us. And during that debate on the Vietnam War, Malcolm also at the time forcefully advocated that the United States should not rule out the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. That's something I think that's been forgotten in our debate now. Indeed, as late as the 1980s, Malcolm said to his biographer Philip Ayres that, and this is a direct quote from Malcolm, "It's not a question of advocating the use of nuclear weapons, but unless the enemy knows you're prepared to, you're hamstrung." Clearly, whether it was on the topic of nuclear weapons, on apartheid, on the defence of Australia, on the rights of the individual, Malcolm had challenging and interesting views on all of these topics. I'd like to conclude on something that's more important to this chamber, and one of Malcolm's key initiatives was to encourage the development of better parliamentary committees in the parliament. In 1965 he was involved in producing a report titled "Parliamentary Committees, a Comparison Between the United Kingdom and Australian Practice", and he argued for the committee system to be expanded here in Australia. This was carried through, of course, in the 1970s, indeed under him as Prime Minister, making it one of his earliest initiatives. And that's something I think all of us senators should be thankful for, as we now have a committee system that is the envy of most parliaments around the world. I want to extend my condolences to Mr Fraser's family and friends, and thank him for being so actively involved in public life for over 6 decades.